data management, excuse me, and reproducibility and subject specialist for data science and computer science at New York University. And we also have Stephanie Labou, the data science librarian at the University of California, San Diego. And they will be talking about creating public-facing documentation about sort of, I would say, like data services kind of, or I guess like data services offerings and perhaps constraints. So sort of what users can expect when they engage in these services at their libraries. As you probably realize, this webinar will be recorded. At some point, will be broken out into breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. So just an FYI. Yeah, and with that, I will hand it over to Vicky and Stephanie.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to come and chat about establishing some guidelines for your data services. I'm going to go ahead and share. And I'm going to pass it off to Stephanie, who's going to open us up with a little bit about why we decided to pursue even writing guidelines.
Yes. So, hi, everyone. Apologies. I can't get my video working today. Of course, just the timing right before this webinar. So, you'll just see my little thumbnail, but I am definitely here and excited to talk about why we would want or need guidelines. And so, we are in libraries for the most part. And if we're not in libraries, then we're still real data enthusiasts. And so, we really hate saying no. We really want to help people work with their data, find their data, do everything they need to do with their data. But sometimes we need boundaries on those services so that we can provide high quality service to as many people as possible. And so occasionally we might see patrons that are really wanting support more suited to tutoring or the role of a teaching assistant. We might see patrons that are monopolizing student employee time, sitting next to a staff desk for an entire shift, asking for constant handholding and step-by-step assistance, or someone who stops by a service point for assistance with their data project every single day. And then, of course, the usual asking for help with homework or final exams or things that are not really well suited to the services we provide. But on the next slide, what we'll see is that really it's not just about putting these guidelines in place to say, please don't monopolize our time. Guidelines are really good for everyone. So employees, especially student employees, should have something formally documented that they can point to. So when patrons cross boundaries or exceed services provided, they're not put in an awkward position of trying to enforce boundaries without it being backstopped by something formal. And this is also to help patrons. Patrons aren't doing this on purpose. They don't really know what they don't know. And this helps set expectations up front by providing clear guidelines about what support is provided. Because often patrons are maybe new to this world of data services and they're talking to their professor and their TAs and the library, and they're just not sure who they should be asking for what kind of support. And so we want to help provide guidelines to make sure that they have a better understanding of what services they can expect to get help with. And so our libraries originally had no external facing service guidelines, right? So we maybe have anecdotal, you know, ad hoc guidelines internally, but if those aren't public facing, what good is that going to do for patrons? And we really had none specifically for reference desk, much less student staffed service points. So again, one of the things that we thought about is that, okay, we've talked about how guidelines are good for everyone, but really this is a lot of the patrons' first time being to these spaces in person. We closed down during COVID. We have students that are used to having online learning. This might be the chance to reestablish the norms of how to interact with our employees. And again, we can't support everything and everyone. We would burn out if we were going to. And so we're looking for a happy medium and the right balance, right? We want to support our patrons to the extent that we can, but we want to establish guidelines and norms up front, especially for those who it's their first time using our services. But also, our boundaries, we want to make sure that we are treating our employees well. They are people. They deserve to be treated well by patrons and not be put in scenarios where they are forced to, on the fly, come up with guidelines that they may not be ready to enforce. And so that's where we were coming from in terms of having this guideline discussion. And so wanting to bring it to the broader IASSIST community to say, we know we're not the only ones having these thoughts and thinking about this. And so Vicky's going to start us off with an overview of the situation at NYU.
Yes, that's a great overview. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our specific use case at NYU of how we established our guidelines, our process, our timeline, and sort of how we revise things going forward. So there's a picture of our lovely data services studio on the 5th floor of Boats Library. At NYU, data services is a joint department of both IT and libraries full-time employees. So some are faculty, some are staff. We also have a lot of student employees who are employed by both the IT and library sides of things. We have lots of desk time Monday through Friday, and our lab is mostly staffed by our student employees. We have software-based services among the typical things you see in a data services, data management services, data publishing, data collection and reference, all of the above. So we are supporting already a lot of stuff. And so we especially need some boundaries because even with just R, I feel like we could occupy all of our time providing support for just R. So like I mentioned, we do a lot. I feel like we see in a lot of places, our consultations one-on-one or with groups. We also have a Discord channel where people ask us questions in like a public setting. And then we also have our behind the scenes IMs. We do a lot of workshops. We maintain that facility. We maintain data collections. And so we have a lot of services that people can take advantage of. We really have to clearly articulate as well the things we don't do. And these were the result of sorry, I forgot to start my timer, so I'm going to start it now. So this is the result of lots of experiences and discussions as a team throughout the years. So, as Steph mentioned, one of the boundaries we put in place is tutoring, where we do not do step-by-step help or tutoring. We try to help people learn independently, so we try to enable that outside learning. We do not support methods at all. If you're coming in and asking us which statistical test should I do, that's not a question that we take on, and we refer people to different resources. We don't do work for hire, which is another request we get quite a lot. And we also don't do very detailed installation help. It's just would put us at max capacity, honestly, with that one, with the whole NYU community, because it's not just people in New York, it's also all of our campuses. So these are some of the things that we have had to enforce boundaries around. So our guideline timeline, say that 10 times fast. So NYU Data Services has been around since, I think, 2010-ish or 2012. We implemented our first set of guidelines in 2019, and this was the result of lots of discussion, which I'll go into. We've had one major revision since then, with minor additions every year following. So we had a really big lift in 2022, and we've found that we've been able to just add things here and there to suit our value, to suit our new realities. So our first set of guidelines, like I mentioned, roughly 9 years after we were founded, we added guidelines that were pretty specific to consultations at this point. We had months of pre-drafting discussions as a team. The actual drafting was done in 2 weeks, done by 2 colleagues. So we did a lot of groundwork discussions. We looked back through our meeting notes to see what issues had come up in the past with the most frequency. We looked through our emails to see where the biggest email chains were. I mean, we really did like a lot of homework about things that were potentially needed boundaries. So we did all this discussion work in months of team meetings. And then 2 colleagues were our sort of first subcommittee to take that on. We had it like about a 2-month feedback loop in the document, which I included a screenshot of here. We decided that we were going to be unanimous about this and that we were going to attach our signatures, not publicly, but privately to this, so that we would all be on the same page as a team. And it first appeared publicly on our guide in 2019. So you'll notice some of these directly speak to some of those boundaries that I mentioned before. We only provide consultation for the software platforms we support. So it's not just anything you walk into the lab with. We have a set list, which was that list that was on the initial slide. You know, all requests should involve activities directly connected to the educational goals of the activity. So we don't do entrepreneurship, outside employment, externships, or paid consultancies. We do not offer method support. So a lot of what we had discussed, we enshrined in this document so we can, again, as Steph said, point to it. So in 2022, we did a major update for both the language of our document and to incorporate things from COVID, frankly. So the department agreed that our initial guidelines read honestly a little bit stuffy. We talked about the meta-literate learner and all this stuff. And we decided we wanted to make the language more accessible to patrons and honestly just sort of simplify it a lot. So 2 colleagues again took on these drafted changes based on a few weeks of discussion as a team. Based on this, we did another round of asynchronous feedback and live discussions. It took about 2 months total. You can see some of the updates here. As a general rule, we provide consultations for the software and coding platforms we support. So coding platforms is new there. We've merged our methods. It's not intended to be step-by-step or tutoring. So we've added some new language. We've bolded things. We have sort of just reorganized. We kept also encountering a situation that we had to put a boundary in about, which I did not think was going to happen. We added it in 2022. But we kept encountering situations where patrons were just showing us like patient data during consultations, or they were using our lab computers to work with this sort of similarly sensitive or private data. And our lab computers actually aren't rated for that level of security. So this was something we had to add in our 2022 updates because it had happened to a number of us across the board. Our qualitative team had, our quantitative team, everybody had this happen at some point or another. And we, at the time, were just like, please don't do that. But we added it in as our guidelines and pointed to some more resources. We also added in a bullet about outside effort because, as Steph mentioned, some patrons come to us to debug every little thing without trying anything themselves. So we have said, we added this bullet in. The patrons made a reasonable effort to accomplish your objective with the supported package prior to requesting the appointment. So we added in a bullet like, you have to put in some reasonable effort before you come and chat with us. You can't just sit and have us sit with you the whole time and debug. We also added a data retention statement because we realized that we wanted to do some outreach with patrons, and this we didn't really know how we should do it. We had their emails from the appointment forms in the past, from workshop signups and things like that. So we decided to add in as part of our guidelines, which is we may retain some of our, request records for planning and outreach and may contact you as a part of that. We debated really hard how to do an unsubscribe option. We never got anybody who was mad about us emailing them, but we're still trying to figure that part out. especially because nothing's automated. So that's been fine so far. We added in some more guidelines around virtual help, and we separated out scheduled consultations from like help on the fly at our data services desk, as well as our virtual platforms that are instantaneous. This was just a gap in our existing guidelines. Like I mentioned, in 2019, they were really focused on the one-on-one interviews, but we have so many more other services where we interact with patrons where we need some bounding boxes, like our workshops, like being on the desk, like our Ask the Librarian chat and our Discord. So we added an addendum for that as well. It's where, again, the majority of our students sit, so it's really important for them to have something to point to. In 2023 and 2024, we've added some very small things. So we added a license. So to encourage adoption of guidelines and just other content from the guide, we're more than happy for people to use whatever part of our guidelines they'd like. We're also currently rewriting our values statement, and we actually did it in a pretty fun way where everyone paired up with one another, rewrote the values as a pair, and then like a subcommittee synthesized it all together. It was really interesting to see how the different pairs of people in the department came up with things. And we are constantly trying to find, as we update like our norms and guidelines and values, different ways to keep connected the IT and library staff that we have. So that's ongoing work, but that is sort of how NYU has approached creating our guidelines. And as they look currently, they are available for anyone to look at on our guide. So that's the headings on the left there, but again, we've licensed it, so feel free to take a look. I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie, who's going to do the use case of UCSD.
So our use case is similar but distinct, kind of like a subset of the full data services at NYU. And so we were really focused on this student staffed service point. So UC San Diego has a data and GIS lab in Geisel Library. It has 5 high-powered desktop computers with dual monitors. It has R, Python, SAS, Data, SPSS, ArcGIS, all the Esri stuff, QGIS. It used to have Atlas TI and NVivo. So it's all that kind of specialized stuff that does exist elsewhere on campus for some things, but for some other softwares, this is the only place on campus where students can get free access to it. And it is an entirely student-staffed service point. And so it's staffed on weekdays, usually about 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Crucially, with our post-COVID return, this was now the only remaining student-staffed service point in the library. And so that was part of our impetus for why we started to need guidelines. And so we used to have a totally different setup. We also went through a physical renovation during this time. And so we used to have other places where patrons would interact with professional staff. Now we have this situation where we have students who are supervised by librarians, but we're remote. And even when we're on campus in the library, we're not sitting right next to them. We're pretty busy. And so we're realizing that we are going to need to wrestle with this, right? If we're asking students to staff this space, they should have a good scope of understanding of their work. It's also self-service library space outside of when it's staffed. And so the door doesn't lock. Anyone can walk in and use the computers. And so our unofficial lab motto is that we help patrons learn how to do their work, but we don't do their work for them. And so the lab has been around for quite a while, but it's always struggled a bit with its sense of self, right? It was originally a fully GIS lab. We don't have a GIS major, but a lot of classes using the GIS software. It has morphed into a data and GIS lab. The idea is that for students that are working on data and GIS lab projects on these computers, there is a student staff employee at the desk that they can ask for help. So let's say you're making a map in ArcGIS and you're having trouble importing something. They can help you work through that and point you to resources. Part of the problem is that this is asking a whole bunch of our student staff, right? We don't expect them to know everything, but they are expected to help work through these, a lot of looking for resources and documentation. And then that was added with a bunch of patrons wandering by and asking how to use the printer. Where is the microfiche collection? And all this stuff that they're not trained on, right? But they are now the only service point and the only student staff service point. And so we realized that is not an ideal situation for our students. They are feeling very stressed out about this. They are feeling like they are not sure what their role is. And we really needed guidelines. So on the next slide, this is what we had and what we thought was sufficient pre-COVID to give patrons an idea of what the lab was about. And so originally it was really focused on what hardware we had and what software we had, and then had a line about, student assistants are available to answer quick questions or provide in-depth consultations. That's extremely broad. We did provide a set of example GIS and data related questions that we could provide support on to kind of give people an idea of content and scope. However, I'm pretty sure most people didn't ever read these. And B, this is not an exhaustive list. And so we had a lot of people coming in and asking for all kinds of things, not necessarily what we were expecting them to ask about, which was, how do I fix this particular error? Next slide, please. So we did have tons of documentation, but for other stuff. So like Vicky's example for NYU, this was a group effort. And so we sat down and said, okay, we have a lot of students coming in using the lab and the staff, the student employee staff resources for not the intended purpose, right? They're asking all sorts of questions about their homework. We're not a tutoring service. We also have a lot of students who seem to think that now this is like their personal support network, which is not the intended case. We have over 42,000 students and 5 desktop computers in the lab and a couple of student employees. That is not something that has the capacity to handhold an individual student through their entire academic career. So we looked through the policies that we did have, and we had a lot of external facing documentation about what people generally, including non-affiliates, could do with the library. So like your general behavior expectations, what you can use the computers for, very, very general. And none of these were really covering what we wanted. And again, we wanted to make sure that we had something specific to this student staffed service space because they really wanted something to point to because again, a lot of the librarians are not on hand to deal with difficult patrons. We are somewhere else on campus, we're in other meetings, and so they needed something that they could point to. So on the next slide, we rely very heavily on the NYU page. And so we started thinking, we can't be the only people thinking, wow, it's so weird that we don't have service guidelines for a student staffed data services option. So we found the NYU page and a few others. And this is where I say the IASSIST HiveMind is wonderful. I posted a question to the IASSIST Discuss listserv. People responded with all kinds of suggestions, which was incredibly helpful. And then myself and the 3 other librarians who co-managed the lab, we took all those examples, picked the pieces that we liked, and pulled together a first draft. And this is where we had originally started and thought, hey, how hard could it be to expand these data services guidelines to cover, librarian work like data management and the consultations I do? The thing is, that turned out to be a can of worms, right? We started talking about, should we have policies or guidelines for what patrons can do for consultations for us? That is a much larger ongoing conversation. And so we made this far narrower back to our original use case of just the data and GIS lab. And so our eventual guidelines are very heavily adapted from NYU, thank you so much, and customized to our local situation. And I have some examples on the next slide. So one of the things that we definitely wanted to add, and of course now I can't remember if this is the exact wording from NYU or something slightly different, is to make sure that patrons understand this is not a homework help or tutoring service. And so we want to fully empower our students to tell users, kind of to Vicky's point about patrons should do a reasonable effort on their own, that we might say, hey, you're wanting to learn about tidy data in R. Here are some tutorials. We can work through a similar problem with a sample data set. Here are some documentation that you can look through. And also, have you tried talking to your TA and your instructor and your departmental resources? Not necessarily having to sit down with them. And the reason we wanted this written out is this was our number one problem area, if that's what we want to call it. Students who this was their first time back in person on campus using these services, and we hadn't done a very good job distinguishing the lab from a tutoring center also in the library on a different floor. And so that was a strong boundary that we needed to set. On the next one, 2 others, we also ran into the same scenario that Vicky mentioned, that we are not IT. We are not going to help you fully install your software, set up your virtual environments, and be your on-call IT support. We can help you look through documentation. We can point to resources, but also there is a campus-wide IT group that you might want to go talk to. And then the bottom one that is circled as well is, because it comes up a few times in our guidelines, because it has come up quite a few times in the lab, is that often we will send patrons back to their instructor, their advisor, their department, someone else, especially when it's a repeat patron. And so we can help, but our help is meant to be sort of these, if not one time, then semi-rare scenarios. So we get honors undergrads who are working on something and they're just encountering something that they need a little bit of extra help with, right? They need to sit down with someone for like 15 minutes and help resolve that. It's not meant to be, I'm starting my research project and I will meet with you weekly for every week for the next couple of years. And this has come up. And so when the use case is turning out to be excessive, or when it feels like the student should now be like a co-author on this particular project, or they should be earning an honorary degree in this domain, we wanted to have language to that effect. So how has it gone so far? This is all new for us. So we had our student employees, we usually have about half a dozen student employees, and they provided us input on our wording. So we took NYU guidelines, other guidelines, made a draft, and then gave it to our students and said, does this match what you want? And we made changes based on their suggestions, based on their experiences. And so they did feel represented. And we wanted to make sure that they were empowered to refer to the guidelines and they knew what those guidelines were. So we haven't had any problems so far. We haven't had any patron complaints. Then again, it's been up for less than 6 months. It went up during the spring quarter. We will see what happens when fall quarter starts and we have an influx of new students. But the good news is that we can start those students off with this as an expectation, as opposed to, it wasn't great timing to put it up during spring quarter because people were already had almost a full academic year to get used to potentially bad habits. But we're going to start fresh in fall. And the one thing that is a real open question is enforcing these guidelines. It's new. We haven't really had a test case. You know, let's say we have a student that is just sitting next to the student employee staff desk, like every single shift, asking for help with their homework and monopolizing this person's time. And our student refers them to the guidelines, and that doesn't change anything. What do we do then? Right? That is something that we need to figure out in terms of how to escalate these and how to put in guidelines for when the librarians might need to be summoned and have discussions about appropriate use of resources. So that remains an open question. So that's where UCSD left off. And I'll hand it back to Vicky, and we're going to get into some interactive components. And I also see that we have some questions in the chat and Q&A that we can try to answer as well at some point.
Yeah, do you want to do that before we get into the activity?
Sure. I tried to answer. There was the question about the scope of these guidelines, a question about were you receiving lots of requests from external people, or was this recognizing that you were already at capacity? In our case, it was an at capacity and an understanding that our time is limited. And so if one person is taking up an hour of that student's staff time every week, that is, 41,999 students that are not able to do that. And so we did anecdotally, when we would stop by the lab, see the same person asking for help. And that means that other students that we could see were kind of hovering to ask for help would give up and leave. And so we wanted to make sure that we had the boundaries because we were kind of at capacity.
Yeah, we definitely had that as well, and we definitely had some patrons we had to email. We do have like a template email for our own enforcement when we feel that we need to like a patron is violating our guidelines. Our first step is to for a full timer to go out, and then the second step is this email that we've all drafted. But we definitely were at capacity in some ways that necessitated like a ring around the service. But we were also getting a lot of requests from external people and a lot of requests for people to work on grants. A lot of the faculty in particular wanted to hire like some of our student workers to work on their grants. And that's something we just had to say, like, none of us do work for hire, including the full timers who people also wanted to contract. So I would say for us, it was both. And that's why we tried to address both in our guidelines.
And there's another
But the
good
scope
question
is good. It's
about
always about experience. Sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
no, that's I was gonna say there's a similar question in the Q&A about so what kind of help like do you offer? If it's we focused a lot on sort of what we don't do. Ours is we have a bunch of different software that we can provide support. We're not statisticians. We're not going to help them pick a test or bless their model or show them how to do things step by step. A lot of what we focus on is twofold, navigating documentation. A lot of times patrons are unfamiliar with coding documentation, and so we train our students on how to find and navigate that documentation. And then honestly, provide additional resources and tutorials for things that are more in depth. We do help them do very specific things when it's pretty easy in the sense of a student says, hey, I get this weird red exclamation mark when I try to import something into ArcGIS. And the answer to that is usually you have a space in your path name and we need to fix that. And so that's more of our focus.
Yeah, we do so much. And that's part of the reason why we needed this. But we do one-on-one and group consults, virtually, in person, workshops. The data collections are a big one. But we teach heavily, and our service is pretty heavily used. So we even just the one-on-one consultations, let's say about like MATLAB, occupy a student a week for us, just because we get a high volume. So as Steph mentioned, it's a lot of things like, debugging, helping transform data into a format where people can use it, evaluating some web resources. So there's a lot that we do provide. The stuff that we don't provide is pretty much like the boundary and the scope is basically when it infringes on providing the best service to the widest amount of people. Like at that point, we put a boundary around a behavior. So that's why we can't do the one-on-one tutoring, because then that time couldn't be used to help another student. We've seen the same example that Steph did of someone hogging the desk and other people walking away. So yeah, that's what I would say as well.
And
But
I
good
see that there's
question.
more, but we can always type some of the answers in
Yeah.
so that there's plenty of time for activities. The best part
Yeah.
about webinars, especially IASSIST webinars, is getting to see IASSIST people. And so a chance to brainstorm with your fellow IASSISTers about boundaries or talk about your service guideline drafts.
Yeah. So you're going to be keeping your own notes in here. So we are going to put you in a breakout room, but take your own notes. In the first half of the exercise, we're going to brainstorm some boundaries you potentially would want in your data services. And then in the second half, if you want feedback on guidelines you already have, or you want to start actually putting words on a document about some guidelines, or even copying and pasting from guidelines that you want to follow, that's what we're going to be doing. But first, we're just sort of wondering where everyone is at. So we did have a little poll, and I will put that in there. But we were just wondering if people could tell us, like, where's your data services at in terms of writing or implementing service guidelines? And hopefully that should just work. But let me know. Okay, if you publish guidelines. Yep. Even spread so far. Wow. Honestly, more published guidelines than I thought. No shade to our wonderful IASSIST community, but this is
Oh,
amazing.
same. I'm now feeling bad. Like we should have had published guidelines way before we did.
Yeah, Lindsay, I think that makes sense. We also, some of our data services do have their own subject specific. Like the quant service does have their own addendum to the guidelines that they do have on their own page. So I would say that counts as published. Okay, great. So we're going to have a good chance for some people to start drafting and some people maybe to get some feedback or solicit some feedback on their own guidelines. Thanks for participating in that. That's a really interesting spread. So in our first activity, like I mentioned, we're going to be brainstorming and we're going to give you, let's say 10 minutes looking at the time. And in your breakout rooms, just discuss, some social or people-centered problems. I don't want to say behavioral problems, but they're a little bit like that. In your data services units with your patrons, any boundaries that you currently have, maybe ad hoc, boundaries that you really would like to implement. And then if like your comfort around enforcing boundaries, because as Steph said, that's sort of an open question for us too. So we are going to put you all in breakouts now. I'm going to leave this up for right now and just have a little discussion. And remember, take your own notes. And then in the second one, we'll come back and talk about it. So let me
pause the recording while we go into breakout room.
We appreciate your participation in breakout rooms. I know it's not everyone's favorite thing, but it is a way to kind of jazz up a webinar and get us to all share our experiences. So, would anyone be willing to share or have an example of, either your guidelines or brainstormed issues that are not already addressed that we might want to incorporate?
This is Mandy Steiger-Hopa. This didn't actually come up in our breakout room discussion, but I was curious about other people's thoughts of, on our guidelines, we have a little section with a header called Partners in Intellectual Contributions. And it's like the kind of parameters of like I can read it just so it's like, when RDS members determine that their support for a research project or teaching curriculum has resulted in substantive intellectual contributions, they will negotiate the appropriate recognition for their intellectual contributions. For example, co-authorships, acknowledgements, thesis, dissertation committee membership, copyright, Creative Commons privileges, etc. So, and there may be a better way to do it, but I don't know if others, if they have any similar types of things or how that has come into play with your services.
I think that's super crucial. We don't have that for our data services per se, but I think it might be in the guidelines we have for our systematic review service. And if not, we really should be, because it has come up a few times. And the understanding of when co-authorship would be provided is not a shared meeting of the minds between where the library's at and where some of our faculty are at. And so that's hugely important. Thank you, Mandy, for bringing that up. Does anyone have examples of that coming up with, like, I've been involved in a few things where the level of code that I wrote, I did end up being a co-author. But that is not formally documented. Does anyone have any data services specific guidelines about that? We should. We
This
should as a
is
group.
Olivia from Temple. This is Olivia from Temple, sorry. We in Philadelphia, in US. We don't have guidelines about this, except for our systematic review service, where it has been a big issue to the point where we're developing an MOU that people need to sign to prevent violations, specifically of the co-authorship and not being credited for our work. That has not yet come up with the data services, but I foresee an issue with that with our GIS services. I supervise the GIS specialists and have already been like coaching him on not so much boundary settings, because we don't have guidelines yet and we don't say no to a lot of things, but just because people really like his work and I can see like it creeping toward, you know, we want to be sure that he gets credited if he is really going to be contributing to a long-term project. So I personally think that stuff's really important.
Paula, I saw your hand go up briefly.
Well, it was, my brain went many places since then, but I think that the thing that characterized our three-person room was that we do completely different things in very, very different organizations, and had each interpreted the term data services differently. And I think that the term data and the term service both mean those two words, and then put together have multiple meanings, which makes it more complicated for patrons to understand where do they get help. So if the library is doing data services and IT is doing data services, how is a patron supposed to figure out which is, well, the one, wait, where do I go? I don't even, and the other piece of it is most of the people who come to me don't know what their problem is. And those that do have narrowed in on, you know, I don't understand this error problem in R, something like that, right? And and they don't know how to get help. They don't know where to go because the vocabulary around all of this is so fuzzy wuzzy.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, I know that we, for instance, don't do any statistical consulting, but we get a lot of students that think that would be included in data services. But the only places are on campus that are on a recharge service to like pay for a statistical consultant, and ours is very different than others. And so, yeah, we don't even have a shared understanding across all our institutions of data services. But I think that also makes it really worthwhile to share guidelines to see what people are putting up as guardrails based on what actually they do support and what their campus needs are specifically. I know we only have a couple moments left. There was a question in the Q&A that we wanted to get to about training students. So it's all well and good to have guidelines, with the caveat that might this be an awesome topic for a whole IASSIST webinar should someone wish to volunteer. But Vicky definitely had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, we do. We have, I didn't realize this till someone asked in the Q&A, have a 1-to-1-ish ratio of student workers to full-timers, which is amazing. And we do a lot of recruiting and training in data services. So the question is, how do you recruit and train student consultants for data services? And we do a lot of very targeted departmental outreach for departments who are both using methods and using tools that have a wide range of support. So like poli-sci at NYU really heavily uses R, and a lot of our quantitative student consultants have come from poli-sci, and we do a lot of outreach there. In terms of training, we have a heavy training program where they get trained not only in sort of the this is how you clock in, but also the customer service aspect of the job, which is the entire job, and how to deal with patrons and when to call us in, and incorporating things like if someone wants to meet with you outside of your work hours, this is also what you can say. You know, if they offer you a job outside of work to do their stats, like I don't know. There's a lot of scenarios we cover, but we cover a lot of those, like how to enforce the boundaries of the guideline, as well as like they meet with every different subject specialist to get an understanding of their service area, to do handoffs and stuff like that. But we do sort of directly address like you are going to be sitting at a desk in a lab. Any person at NYU can walk in and talk to you. They might be like flustered because it's finals week, and this is how you deal with that. Is a big part of our curriculum. So I know about you as well, Stephanie, because I know you have a lot of students as well.
It's similar, and I was putting in the chat, part of this in terms of our guidelines is also that the level of service we can offer kind of depends on the students that we have that year. And so one year we had a student who was just also like a graphic designer by passion and was fantastic and ended up redesigning a bunch of stuff for us and helping a bunch of students with poster layout and like color theory and data visualization. But that's not what we hired for necessarily. That was just a bonus. And occasionally we'll get people who are really strong in R, and then we can do really robust R drop-ins. And like I can send patrons to the lab because I know that the person working there is really strong in R. But this year we didn't really have anyone. And so I get all those questions. And so the actual content areas do tend to vary. We train our students, but we're very focused on we don't expect you to know everything. You can learn along with the patron, and that is completely fine. It's more about thinking through a problem than actually being able to answer a problem. But I am jealous about the onboarding and training that it sounds like the NYU students get. That's amazing.
We'll see how much they like it. It's a lot in their first week, but no big complaints so far.
So
We're
thanks
at
everyone.
yeah.
I was gonna say we're at time. But we didn't quite get to our interactive part of like drafting and critiquing each other's guidelines. But this is a great group if you wanna email the full discuss listserv if you want feedback, or email the people from your breakout rooms to sort of crowdsource and get feedback on some of your guidelines. We can keep this going over email.
Definitely. Thank you all for your time and attention. We hope you got something you can take home. But feel free to be in touch.
Thanks, Vicky and Stephanie. And everyone, we'll see you online.